Living in southern Italy in the late 1800s was not an easy time. Northern Italy treated its neighbor to the south as inferior and ignored and terrorized it into subservience. Life was precarious at best, and for bread and work, millions of peasants immigrated to preserve their families. They brought their own unique way of life to America. They came by boat, traveling in the steerage, a dark, cavernous part of the ship that was poorly ventilated. With disease and sickness all around them, the immigrants made the best of it. On days when the weather permitted, they were allowed on deck for fresh air and relaxation. 10 to 14 days later, the Statue of Liberty was an awe-inspiring sight. Upon arrival, they were processed on Ellis Island, being subjected to a variety of legal and medical examinations before being allowed into America. In 1896, Michele Vitarelli, at the age of 16, came from San Marco in the province of Foggia to Waterbury, Connecticut. At the time, this city was an industrial center for the brass industry, and like many others, Michele worked in a factory doing menial labor. A year later, Annunziata Accatura, also from San Marco, came to live in Waterbury. The Vitarellis and Accaturas knew each other in the old country, and when Annunziata turned 14, and Michele was 21, the match was made, and they were married in 1902. In 1899, Francesco Cicchetti left Salenza Valfattore in Foggia, bound for America, where he settled in Waterbury. Here he could openly express his socialist views without condemnation. While in Italy, he worked as a cabinet and casket maker. In America, he found employment in a factory making pins. In 1900, Maria Gammieri arrived in America with her 3 sisters. Angelina, the oldest, failed a medical examination and was sent back to Italy. The others settled on Elizabeth Street in New York's Little Italy. There they worked in sweatshops as seamstresses. A marriage between Francesco and Maria had been planned in Italy. On October 15, 1901, Maria took a train from New York to Waterbury, where she was met by Francesco with surrey and horse. They were married soon after. In 1907, Clement Vaccino, a shoemaker from Arezzo, married Josephine Palella from Caserta. He then left for America to seek his fortune and told his bride that he would come back for her. In 1911, after 4 years with no word from her husband, Josephine sold all of her jewelry and used the money to buy a ticket to America. Once there, she began her life with Clement. In 1909, Catello Calabrese, a farmer from Castellamare, was recruited by a locksmith company as cheap labor and came to New Haven, Connecticut when he was 21. He lived with Gennaro Delito from Amalfi. Gennaro's niece Maria was 17 when she arrived in New Haven to live with her sister, Antoinette, and her family. A few years later, Catello and Maria were introduced. They were married in 1915. During the first decade of the 20th century, the first generation of Italian Americans began to appear. They were all bilingual, speaking Italian with their families and English with others. Some of their parents never mastered the language of their new country. With a strong work ethic, deep family ties, and a sense of community with their own, their lives began. They continued the traditions brought over from Italy. The Vitarellis had their first child 2 years after they were married. The Cicchettis began having children immediately. Less than a year after Josephine came to America, the Vaccinos had their first child. The Calabrese's first child, Joseph, arrived 10 months after they were married. In Waterbury, Francis Vitarelli was dating his future wife, Angela Cicchetti. They were chaperoned by Romeo, his younger brother, and Angela's younger sister, Genthia, now known as Eva. Romeo, a carpenter by trade, and Eva, a salaried secretary because of her beautiful handwriting, fell in love. A 9-year courtship ensued, and they were married in 1935. 2 years later, they moved into a home built by Romeo. In 1936, Rose Vicino, a 14-year-old high school student, and her friend Josephine were walking down Grand Avenue in New Haven. Joseph Calabrese, an 18-year-old salesman, noticed Rose while driving with his friend Chick. They stopped to introduce themselves. Soon after, Rose and Joseph began to date. 5 years later, when he was 23 and she was 19, they married. They left New Haven for the suburb of Orange into a home Joseph built. During the 1930s, the second generation of Italian Americans were being born. Most were all Italian and continued to speak this language, but only to their grandparents. Traditions continued to be passed down, but a sense of community was lessened as more and more of this generation moved out of the neighborhoods and into their own homes. They no longer saw their families every day. In 1940, Romeo and Eva had their second son, Robert Francis. He graduated high school and attended college. This was a door opened by his father, who toiled his whole life so that his sons wouldn't have to work the long hours of their father and grandfather. In 1942, Joanne Francis was the first child of Joseph and Rose. She was the first in her family to attend college. Her father had built his fortune tirelessly until he was 55 when he retired. Although he left high school, his hard work allowed his children to enjoy a better life than his own. During their college years, Joanne and Robert were introduced by mutual friends. They thought the two should meet because it seemed they had a lot in common. Bob and Joanne lived only 30 minutes from each other in Connecticut. In 1964, they began to date and married in February 1965. During the 1960s, the third generation began. No longer was the entire generation of Italian descent. The family had now spread to many different areas, and weekends were for visiting. Holidays and special occasions were the time when the whole family shared some of the old traditions. Italian was rarely spoken, but some of the traditions, such as eating fish on Christmas Eve and bocce games in the summer, still continued. Joanne and Bob's first son, Douglas Robert Vitarelli, is born on October 1st, 1965. 100 years earlier, his great-grandfather had stepped foot into a new world. Douglas now has over 200 relatives that can trace their roots back to 6 small towns in southern Italy. The hard work of the previous 3 generations has made the problem of bread and work non-existent. Although more American than Italian, Douglas's generation will be the last to have close ties to the old country. The traditions that will be passed down will be diluted with those of other cultures. And although ending a way of life that is uniquely Italian, the 4th generation will add spice to one that is uniquely American.